first off, that is not twin brothers. That is two people that were separated by over 100 years. They didn't know each other, but yet they were incredibly important to the history of Scottsdale at the two different times that they were around. On the left is Winfield Scott. We're going to talk about him. That's the Scott of Scottsdale. And on the right is Herb Drinkwater. And if you were ever around here during that time, Herb Drinkwater is our beloved mayor, and we're going to talk about him today. All the photos you're about to see, unless we say photo credit from something, are from the Scottsdale Historical Society, and all of these photos are available anytime on the library's website. You can actually search, like if you want to search Winfield Scott, you'll find all sorts of pictures about him. Herb Drinkwater, there'll be all sorts of pictures about him. The second note is that I've chosen 18 people from about 140 years to tell the story of Scottsdale, but I could have easily done 30, 40, 100 people, and I wouldn't have told everything about the history of Scottsdale. That gives me job security. I can always come back and do more presentations. But being that as it may, I just want to apologize right now if one of your ancestors, relatives, friends, or you yourself is not mentioned and you feel you should have been mentioned. I just couldn't do everybody. I apologize. So let's, before we get started with the story about Scottsdale, let's give you some historical perspective. That's a map of the United States in 1888. What I love about this is Phoenix isn't on the map. That's Prescott is on the map as the capital of the territory of Arizona. And the second biggest city is Tucson, and that's on the map of Arizona. But all the rest of that, like things like if you look at it, it depends how close you are to see it, but for example, there's no South and North Dakota, there's just the Dakota Territory on this map. This is 1888. And something happened that's very crucial to Arizona in 1888 that had repercussions, and it also has amazing parallels to recent events. The major event that happened in 1888 was the presidential election of Benjamin Harrison and Grover Cleveland. Now, Grover Cleveland was the incumbent Democrat, and he was against Senator Benjamin Harrison, who was the Republican challenger. And an amazing parallel to the last presidential election of 2016, Grover Cleveland won the popular vote, but Benjamin Harrison won in the Electoral College. And why does that matter for Arizona? Well, who's ever the president appoints the territorial governor. So that party is kind of in charge of Arizona during that time of that person's presidency. And the governor at this time was Conrad Meyers-Zulick, and he's one of my favorite territorial governors because he has such a great story behind him. When he was first appointed by Grover Cleveland, he could not accept. And the reason was, he was in jail. Conrad Meyers-Zulick was in charge of a firm, a mining company, and the mining company, unfortunately for him, had some dealings in Mexico, and the Mexican government felt that he owed them money and that he hadn't paid. So he went down to try and resolve it, and they just threw him in jail and said, as soon as you pay, you can get out. Well, he gets appointed governor of Arizona, and what happens? A very Arizona thing, the way to solve this problem. We're not going to pay. No, we're Arizona. So 20 guys under the command of a guy named Doc Donovan leave Prescott, Arizona, and ride down through Phoenix, through Tucson, through Tombstone, all the way down to Sonora, Mexico, where they bust him out of prison. And they don't even tell them why he's doing it. They just bust him out and they bring him back. And when he gets to Tombstone, which is right there on the map, suddenly he's saying, people are addressing him as governor. And he's like, well, why are you calling me governor? Oh yeah, we forgot to tell you. We busted you out so you could become the governor of Arizona. I'm governor? Wow. And so they take him back to Prescott and he is the governor of Arizona. Then so he was appointed by Cleveland, so when Benjamin Harrison wins, he kicks out Zulick and all of his people, and then the next election, Grover Cleveland wins. It goes back and forth and has big effects. Just so that you think about this, 1888 is the time we're about to talk about. This is 8 years after the gunfight at the OK Corral. There's only been trains going through Arizona for about 6 years at this time. And they don't go through everything. They go through very select cities. And into this comes Winfield Scott. Now, first off, there's another guy who was already here in the Phoenix area named W.J. Murphy. And he was contracted to build the Arizona Canal. And he built the Arizona Canal, the same canal that we have today that goes through Scottsdale, was built by this man named W.J. Murphy. And he wanted people to come down here, and people didn't want to buy the land until they saw that there was a working farm. So W.J. Murphy pushed the government, and they passed a thing called the Desert Land Act of 1877, and that gave the price of land very cheap, but you had to buy water rights to be a farmer, and that was about 3 times the cost of the land. So Winfield Scott is convinced to come down by W.J. Murphy and all these other townspeople of Phoenix to this area. But what are we going to call this area? It doesn't have a name. What could they call this area in 1888? They called it the desert. And they figured, well, we got to give it a better name than the desert. Why don't we call it the Salt River Valley? Ooh, they were marketers back then. And so they called it the Salt River Valley. They approached Winfield Scott. So let me tell you a little bit about him. He was born in 1837 in West Novi, Michigan. He was raised in upstate New York, where he was a Baptist minister. He was raised on a farm, then he became a Baptist minister. He served in the Civil War, and he was known as the fighting parson because he was right alongside the troops fighting against the Confederacy. He was a Union soldier. And when he ended that, he decided to go back into the Baptist ministry full time. The Baptist ministry realized that this man was an incredibly powerful speaker. When he would come on Sunday morning to some town to speak, the entire room would be full. Everyone wanted to hear him. The very next week, there'd be like 10 people showing up for the regular minister. So they kept moving him around, and he would get communities to build a church, and then as soon as it was up and going, they'd move him somewhere else and put a regular minister in there. And they kept doing this. So after a while, he said, well, it just feels like I'm in the army again, and the army was paying more consistently, so why don't I just go back in the army? So he does, and what do? They move him around to build churches and to help in the different forts all around the United States, and he moves all over the place. At the time of 1888, he's in Angel Island, just outside of San Francisco in California, and he's on his way to a convention of the Baptist Ministry Convention, and he's asked to stop here. And when he stops here, they take him out and they show him this land. And of course, this is what Scottsdale looks like today. There was nothing here. It was just all desert. And you see, hopefully you can see my little arrow. Down here is the area we're talking about. He purchased 640 acres from Indian School Road to Chaparral, from Scottsdale to Hayden. And one of the reasons he took this land is, you see, the Arizona Canal goes right through it, so he's got water. Very clever guy. And he paid the amazing sum, even at that time, of $2.50 per acre to buy that land. But think about this. He's got to pay 3 times that for the water rights. So he's got to come up with some money. He's in the army. He's not getting paid a fortune. He doesn't have any independent wealth. So how's he going to do it? Well, first off, who's going to do all those things? Because he's in the army. So he sends his little brother, George Washington Scott, and he's, in effect, the first resident of Scottsdale. But it wasn't called Scottsdale. It was just the Salt River Valley. He's the first resident in 1888. He has another guy named Bert Spencer, and the two of them hired local help. And they cleared the land, and they put in an orange orchard, because Winfield Scott had this idea of this beautiful orange orchard, and that there was nobody who had oranges on this side of the country, so he would be quite wealthy, and he was right. So Winfield Scott figured out he's got to pay off the land, and he's got to pay off the expenses for his brother to do all the work. So how's he going to do it? He starts doing some land trading right away. So here's his land, Chaparral to Indian School, Scottsdale to Hayden. The first thing he does, the blue line that you see right down here, that's the Arizona Canal. So everything north of this is higher elevation, and this is all lower elevation. And he wants to irrigate using gravity, so higher elevation doesn't work. So the first thing he does is he gives back 40 acres back to the government. Says, I don't want that land. we're done. Next thing, I'll tell you how I used to think it was, and I'll tell you how I found out recently the real thing was. He organized, set aside 40 acres, and he convinced this lady named Mary Brown that he would get the land all set for him. He would build a house for her. He'd have the land ready, and she could just walk in, and he sold the land to her for $30 an acre. And I thought, this is a Baptist minister? Well, fortunately, someone in the library, Richard Howley, found the rest of the story in a historical journal. Turns out that this wasn't just any lady. This was his sister-in-law. And she didn't get conned by him. She lent him the money. He felt guilty, so he gave her, in effect, this land, all set up, did all the work for it, and claimed it was at $1,200 of value just because he felt so guilty about lending money from his sister-in-law. And then his sister-in-law got to live near them, so they were all happy. The second thing he did is he contacted W.J. Murphy and showed how this orange orchard was being so prosperous. And W.J. Murphy said, this is great, I want to buy it. So he buys 360 acres of the land for $9,000, $25 an acre, and he makes enough money from that to pay off all the money that he owes, pays off his brother, pays for the water rights, and even has a nest egg of money that he lived off and then his wife lived off for the rest of her life. It was quite a good transaction. But he found out that he did a little bit too much trading. He wanted this orchard in the southern part of his property. Again, that's W.J. Murphy who bought it. So he bought back that section, number 4, back to have his orchard in that part. So now he's in Scottsdale, well, but it's not called Scottsdale. He's in the Salt River Valley. He has this area. And here's a picture, one of my favorite pictures of Winfield and Helen Scott. It's taken around 1900. Helen is on top of his army mule, Old Maud. And I had one person tell me that you see that Helen Scott is holding something in her hand that sticks out, and someone told me that was his cavalry sword. And I disagreed with that because, first off, you don't see the hilt. If it was a cavalry sword, there would be a hilt to protect the hand. You can see Helen Scott's hand. I believe that was a riding crop. The other reason that I didn't think it was a cavalry sword is that he was in the army, not the cavalry. So it wouldn't be a cavalry sword. It could be an army sword, but it wouldn't be a cavalry sword. The other thing I'll tell you just very briefly, and some of you may have heard this one already, if you look at Helen Scott's skirt, and if you look right here, you'll see the outline of a person. And I didn't even notice that for about 6 years of using this photo to teach history. I discovered it one night and realized that there was an outline of a person, and the person's actually standing off camera. He got cropped out. And I do a whole presentation on that guy and how he's been essentially cropped out of history over and over and over again. And if you ever hear that I'm doing the class called Scottsdale Behind the Photos, this is the first photo I show, and I explain the whole backstory to this photo. This statue, or this photo is so famous that they made a statue of it. Georgianne Tegnaty made this in 2007. And you'll notice she did something very wise. She made the riding crop end at her shoulder. Could you imagine if it was out farther like it really was? Kids would be hanging off that thing all the time. It wouldn't be good. If you ever want to see this, it's right in front of the Little Red Schoolhouse. It's in a walking distance from where we are right now, just down the mall towards Brown Avenue. Winfield Scott first built a wooden house. It burned to the ground. So then he built an adobe house, and he made friends with his neighbors, which were the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community, and they came over and they taught him how to build a Pima Ramada. This area right here is called the Pima Ramada. Once they taught him how to do it, he taught many of the other early residents of Scottsdale how to make a Pima Ramada, which was an incredibly important thing during the summertime. In the summer, you could cook and eat out in the Pima Ramada and not in your home, so you didn't heat up your home. Remember, there was no microwaves back then. Everything had to be heated up in a stove and generate all that heat. So the Pima Ramada was something very good for the sanity of all the people that lived in the early times. You also see these two outhouses They're not outhouses. They are houses that are outside of the main house. They were sometimes used by his hired hands. Sometimes in the winter it could be a cook shack, could be storage, whatever they needed. Now you say to yourself, is there anything that I could see today that was made or was done by Winfield Scott? Well, yes, there are. There are olive trees planted down in a row. You see it from this aerial photograph from 1954 of Scottsdale. And we would call those olive trees, they're on Drinkwater Boulevard, just a little bit over to the west from us right now. And if you would go as recently as, say, a year or two ago, you could do it today, you see the same olive trees. One or two olive trees have been hit by cars, and they've been replaced by, and you can definitely tell which are the older olive trees and which are the younger olive trees. But you can see these planted by Winfield Scott, and they continue right in front of Los Olivos. You can see these old olive trees. Now we're going to talk about the Victorian House of Scottsdale. In 1892, Frank Titus, who was a railway baron from California, came to Scottsdale, and it wasn't Scottsdale at this time, again, it was just the Salt River Valley, and he built this home, and he hired the best builder of his day, a man named James Miller Creighton. There's a picture of him. He built just about every famous big building from 1880 to 1920 in the entire state of Arizona. And many of them are still around. Here's some examples. The President's House of Tempe Normal School, which we would call Arizona State University, was built and still stands on the grounds of Arizona State University. Old Main at the University of Arizona was built by James Miller Creighton. There's so many more, but these are the ones that I could find photos of to show you. So all of these incredible things have been built by him, and Frank Titus wanted the best, so he brought in James Miller Creighton to build his house. Now, his house was built, this of course is McDowell Road, this is Hayden Road, Granite Reef, here's the Loop 101. So if you just go a little bit to the south, you see this red area right here. It's just south of McDowell Road. You cannot miss it when you go by. It's at 1310 North Hayden Road. Oh, there's some other landmarks for you. General Dynamics, El Dorado Park, Vista del Camino. And that's what it looks like today. Now, I've been doing this presentation since the fall of 2017, and every once in a while, someone will contact me afterwards and say, you know, I knocked on the door and I asked for a tour, and they wouldn't give me a tour of their house. This is not a museum. This is not anything for public display. This has been a continuously owned home since 1892. So please respect the owners of their home, just like you wouldn't want someone to come to your house, knock on the door and say, will you give me a tour of your home? Well, you don't know who this person is. So please, no trespassing. You can take pictures from the outside of the house if you want to take a picture. They don't have a problem with that. But please don't knock on their door and ask them for a tour. We can't take questions right now. Sorry. Another fun section of this one is what's in a name. So in the 1890s, there was 3 reasons people came to this Salt River Valley. They said you came for busted health, busted wealth, or busted reputation. Busted health was because if you got tuberculosis, they would tell you go to a dry climate, and you weren't allowed to go to Phoenix because Phoenix didn't want the tuberculosis patients there. There was a tuberculosis hospital in Tempe, and Sunny Slope was originally its own town with a tuberculosis community there until it was finally taken over by the city of Phoenix. But Scottsdale was close enough, and you were allowed to. But this wasn't Albert Utley. Albert Utley was considered busted reputation. He was a banker from Rhode Island, and he got married, and his wife's father asked him to go into business. He had a lumber business, and he said, okay, I've looked at your equipment, we need to upgrade. Oh, no, you don't have to upgrade. We can just do with what we have. Well, you could do so much more capacity. No, you don't have to do that. Finally, the business goes bankrupt. And the Utley name is not in the best reputation for Rhode Island, so he decides to leave, and he happens to be related to W.J. Murphy through marriage. So he comes down to Phoenix, and he finds out about the Desert Land Act, and he decides, I'm going to buy some land. So he purchases the land that is south of Indian School to Thomas, from Scottsdale to Hayden, another 640-acre tract. And he decides to set aside the northern western tip of this property to become a town, but he's got to come up with a name. He's trying to think, what could I call this town? So he decides he's going to consult with his family back in Rhode Island, so he had to write him a letter. So we don't know exactly what the letter said, so I'm going to take a little artistic license. So here's what I think it said. Dear family, it's me, Albert. I'm thinking about having a town. I'm going to give it a name. What do you guys think of the name? Utleyville. He gets a letter back. Dear Albert, thank you for the letter. We don't think Utleyville's a good name. Not that it's not a good name, but our name has a bad reputation right now. So no one's going to move from Rhode Island to this new town based on Utleyville. Why don't you come up with a different name? So he goes back, and he thinks. Finally, he comes up with it, and he writes, Dear family, thank you for your wise counsel. I won't call it Utleyville. But I was thinking a lot about my brother-in-law, W.J. Murphy. He built the Arizona Canal, all this land. He's wheeling and dealing. He's a famous guy. He's a big deal here. Why don't we call the town Murphyville? And he gets the letter back. We of course know about W.J. Murphy. He's quite famous, but he started his own town on the west side of Phoenix, and he didn't call it Murphyville. He called it Glendale. So if he's not going to call his own town Murphyville, why don't we come up with a different, better name? Okay. So now he's got to think of a different name, and he thinks about Winfield Scott. He's right there. He's grown this orange orchard. Everyone loves this orange orchard. It's bringing prosperity to the area. It's bringing more people, just his name. He's right there. He's right next to the town, so he could promote the town. What a perfect thing to have him right there. So he writes his letter. Dear family, thinking about your wise advice, I've been thinking a lot about Winfield Scott. His orange orchard is causing a lot of prosperity. He's right there. So what do you guys think about the name Orangedale? And the family writes back and says, what a great idea, go ahead. So on February 1894, he records the town, unincorporated town, as Orangedale. And we all live in the city of Orangedale, and I work for the city of Orangedale. Of course, there's a little bit more to the story, right? He does some other things. Here's a picture of the original town. I love this photo. This building right here, first off, it is a roofed building, but the walls are made of canvas so that they could cool it in the summertime, because there's no air conditioning in 1900 when this picture was taken. That building right there, that's where the Chase Bank sits at Indian School Road and Scottsdale Road on the southeast corner. This house right here, that's Judson Elliott's house, and that's where the drive-through is for that same Chase Bank. These, what look like buildings over here, those are actually tents that people put up, and this would probably be around where the Sugar Bowl is today. You see, there's one telephone pole, there's one telephone in all the town, and that's for the Arizona Canal to make sure if something goes wrong with the canal that they could call Phoenix and get help. There's no telephone for general use for the general people of Scottsdale at this time. He names what we call Indian School Road, he calls it Utley Avenue. And this is a picture of 68th Street looking to the east. You see this building, I believe this is part of the Underhill House, and this large cottonwood that's sticking out, that's part of Winfield Scott's farm. And then you can see the cabins there and the people's homes over there that we just saw in the previous picture. He plots out the land, he divides it up into very similar to what we have today, but he names the streets after Civil War generals, Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, Garfield. He also calls what we call Scottsdale Road Paradise Street. So have you guys noticed that whatever he named never stuck? That's what happened. Finally, he decided he wanted to get some advertisement for the town. So he contacted the Arizona Republican newspaper. It was called the Republican until the 1920s when it was changed to the Arizona Republic newspaper. And he asked for a reporter to come down. The reporter says, how am I going to find this town? He said, go to Winfield Scott's farm and then go south, you'll find the town. So he goes there and he ends up talking to Winfield Scott, and everyone he talks about Winfield Scott, and he writes a story, and the story's not really about the town, it's all about how great Winfield Scott is. So he comes back, he gives it to the editor reads it, says, Orangedale? They couldn't have really named it Orangedale, that must be a mistake. They must have meant to name it Scottsdale. Yeah, that's it. They called it Scottsdale. So the Republican renames the town Scottsdale. And this is a story that Paul Messenger tells, that because of this, people just heard the name and it was so much better than Orangedale. They just said, Scottsdale. Yeah, we like that. And Utley was saying, no, it's Orangedale. By August 1894, he gave up, he went back to the county recorder and he recorded the town as Scottsdale. And we've been Scottsdale ever since. So that's how our city got its name. One of the biggest things why you never hear Albert Utley as a founder of Scottsdale is he never even lived in the area. He lived in Phoenix. This is his mansion, or it looks like a mansion when you compare it to what we just saw of Winfield Scott's house, that was at 11th Street in McDowell. So he never was even in, he came over here, he certainly had lots of dealings here, so he's kind of like our first developer, but not really one of our first residents. Scottsdale Unified School District, well, now called Scottsdale Unified, at this time, Scottsdale School District. Winfield Scott in 1896 decides we need a school district. We have all these kids, we need a school district, we need a school to teach them, and that's what's going to really bring people. A good school district will bring people to come to live to this town. So he goes to the Maricopa County Board of Education, or whatever it was called at that time, and he says, I want to start a school district. And they say, now wait a minute, Winfield, you know the rules. You have to have 17 children to have a school district. And he says, that's okay, we've got 17 children, we're good. No, now Winfield, a probate judge has to go to your town and count the children till we know that there's 17 children. Well, Winfield Scott knew the Haydens had recently moved into town. That's 6 kids right there. And he knew that several families had moved in and they would have no problems making 17 children. So the probate judge comes down, counts the kids, we're good to go, and we have the 48th school district in the state of Arizona. It was originally a one-room schoolhouse. You see it there with Camelback Mountain in the background. It was built in a day by the townspeople. It quickly was outgrown, so it became a 2-room schoolhouse, and then a 3-room. They just kept having to build additions. Finally, it just wasn't working. So Winfield Scott, about 1908, approached the town and he said, we need a really big, so that we can put the school district our school all in one place and not have all this craziness of annex rooms. And he asked the townsfolk to build a $5,000 bond to build a new schoolhouse. And they build what we call today the Little Red Schoolhouse. This is a picture approximately 1910, and you see a lot of the next generation of famous people of Scottsdale, and you'll see lots of famous names. For example, this boy on top of the horse, that is a Hayden. He's next to a Brown, and when we say Hayden, not the Tempe Haydens of Hayden's Ferry, this is a different Hayden family that is our Hayden Road. Brown Avenue from our old town, that's a daughter. And there's some other people here. Brownie, who is the E.O. Brown's son, we'll talk about, he's right about here. And this little boy wearing the sailor suit, do you see him? That's Bill Miller, Charles Miller's son. Now, the story behind him for this day was he was so proud that he was the only kid in town that had a sailor suit. So he wore it for the photograph that day. And I guess he was maybe strutting around a little bit too much because he got teased so mercilessly for wearing this that he never wore it again. Now, Bill Miller's going to keep popping back into the story at different times, so just remember the sailor suit. The population continued to grow, and finally they had to start building annex rooms annex buildings next to the Little Red Schoolhouse. Those annex buildings have since been all torn down. And finally they had to move the school outgrew it, and they had to move it a little bit further to the west. And the Little Red Schoolhouse began a life of different uses. For a while, it was used to train, to teach Mexican children who had come recently, to teach them English. And then it became the Scottsdale Police Department, and then and the jail, and then it became the library, then it became the Chamber of Commerce, and then it became the Little Red Schoolhouse that we know and love, the Museum of Scottsdale. Main Street means business. You got to have a business, you have to have a post office, right? If you're going to have a town. So here's the guy, James L. Davis, in 1897, came down, started a town. And, not a town, I'm sorry, started a business. He opened it up, his grocery store and post office on Brown and Main on the southwest corner where Bischoff's Shade of the West is located today. Now, he needed someone to help him, and one of the people that was in the town was a very clever lady named Sarah Caldwell Thomas. She moved because her husband had tuberculosis, and she was finding that he wasn't able to do as much. It was certainly bothering him, so she got a job baking and helping him around the store. Here's a picture of her a little bit later on. And a clever businesswoman, she took out a life insurance policy on her husband, and her husband died of tuberculosis complications, and she bought out the store, and she became the second postmistress of Scottsdale and owned the general store. So now she's running the place, but she starts getting sick. Perhaps tuberculosis, something was going wrong. She was feeling ill. She's a single mother running a business, and she contacts her sister and her brother-in-law and asks them to come down. And that was E.O. Brown. E.O. Brown comes from Wisconsin in 1904. He comes down and becomes a minority owner and the manager of the general store. One of the things that he does is he wants the store to look a little bit more solid than a wooden building, so he builds it out of brick. Here's a picture from the 20s that we can see the inside of the store. This area in the back is where they did the butchering for meat. I don't know if you can see it all, but this photo is something that I'm going to do in the presentation next month called Scottsdale Stories with a Twist. It all starts from this photo, so I'll explain more about it in that presentation. E.O. Brown was an incredible entrepreneur. Just like Winfield Scott was the perfect person at his time to get people to come down to Scottsdale, to this new place, E.O. Brown was like the Energizer Bunny. He just kept going and going. Let me give you some examples. He was, of course, the co-owner and the postmaster of the town. He was on the school board. He was the irrigation director, so if two farmers were arguing over irrigation, he resolved it. He was the president of the oil company. He was president of the cotton gin. A cotton gin was used to process cotton. It was very hard work, very labor intensive. So E.O. Brown went down to Mexico, and he brought a lot of the workers to come back with him to work here. And they referred to themselves as the Mexicanos of Scottsdale. And they called their neighborhood, instead of the barrio, they called it the Escatel. And we're actually right now sitting on the area. This was part of the Escatel. So that was all from the cotton gin. And that was really big in World War I because they needed cotton during the war. He was the owner of the waterworks and the local ice plant. So you think that's pretty good for his whole life, right? This is just his first 10 years. These aren't even the things he's known for. Let me go over some of the things he's famous for. In 1918, his wife and the wife of two other people, Charles Miller and Mort Kimsey, came to their husbands and said, "It's 1918. We're still using candles. Phoenix has had electric power since the 1880s. We want electric power now." These three men were not stupid. They immediately formed the Scottsdale Light and Power Company and arranged for power to come to Scottsdale in 1918. We'll talk about another one of them in just a minute. He purchased not only DC Ranch, the land, but he bought the brand DC Ranch from a man named Doc Crosby Some people say that Doc Crosby DC Ranch. Some people say it was the desert camp. I don't know, but those are the two leading theories. And then he also ended up starting Brown's Ranch a little bit further north. And at one point, he controlled about 30,000 acres of North Scottsdale, of what is today North Scottsdale. And he had a co-owner of this, and that was Wilfred Hayden of Hayden Road fame. He started the first bank of Scottsdale, the Farmers State Bank, in 1921, and you see it's right next door to his general store, now made with brick, and the bank made of brick in 1921. Well, it was going great until 1933. There was the Great Depression and a bank holiday, and they had to close the bank for a run on the bank, and it never opened again. So this became a real estate office, it became the Chamber of Commerce office. Nothing really stuck until 1951, when it became the Rusty Spur Saloon. And it still is today the Rusty Spur Saloon. If you go there and you look where they store the alcohol, it's in the vault of the old bank. And if you're new to Scottsdale, or if you have winter visitors and you want to have a little fun with them, and you don't know about the Rusty Spur, between December and April, we have a singing cowboy. His name is Gary Sprague, thank you. And he goes on his trusty steed, Dusty, and they ride around Old Town, and he's on top of the horse, he sings with a guitar, and he tells jokes. It's very fun. But at 4 p.m., he goes into the Rusty Spur with the horse to get a drink. So if you want to have some fun with your neighbor or your winter visitors, don't tell them. Just say, hey, we're going to go over the Rusty Spur. Get there around before 4 p.m. so you get a seat, because there's usually music on Saturday afternoons. And just sit there and then watch your winter visitor's jaw hit the ground when a cowboy goes through the swinging doors on horseback and starts playing the guitar. It's really funny. In fact, I took a picture of it. Here's Bischoff Shade of the West on the corner, and there's the Rusty Spur. And then here's a picture of Gary taken around Christmas time a couple years ago inside the Rusty Spur. Now, if you see this lady, where is she? This lady right here with the grayish hair, the horse, Dusty, for some reason just loved her hair. I don't know why, kept nibbling at it. And the lady, I think she first thought it was like a fly or something, and then she looks and it's a horse, and she jumps. It was really funny. And as soon as she would think she had gotten the horse to let him alone, they would do it again. And she kept stop it, get away from me. It was so funny that Gary actually said, would you come to all my shows? You're hysterical. Now we're going to talk about the second family, about the electric power, the Millers. And the Millers make their mark in Scottsdale. Charles Miller lived in South Dakota in 1908, and he was traveling in a train, and the Earth magazine was on the Santa Fe Railroad, and he was reading through it, and he saw the picture of an oat field. And he knew what the size of an oat field. Oat field's 5-6 feet tall, and he sees this photo of a man on horseback. That man is Winfield Scott. And it said, this Salt River Valley farmer challenges the world to beat his oat field. He was so impressed that an oat field could be that tall, he said, I'm going to buy that oat field. And he picked up his family, and he moved to the town, and he happened to be here right at the last 2 years of Winfield Scott's life. And Winfield was getting, in his 70s, he's ready to slow down a bit. So he sells his farm to Charles Miller. 80 acres, or 120 acres of it were sold. Here's his family, Daisy, his son Bill, and his daughter Murle. Now, Bill Miller is the boy with the sailor's hat. When he gets a few years older than that, he's going to high school. Well, there was no high school in Scottsdale, so you have to go to Tempe. His father gave him a Model T Ford, which even in those days was an old Model T Ford, to go up to high school. And his best friend, Hunter Chestnut, and he both had Model T Fords, and they would race them to school every morning. And I couldn't find a picture of that, so I found the closest thing on Google. That is a picture of two people racing, but this is not, of course, those two people. That's just a stock photo. Well, one day, the deputy who was in charge of the Tempe area had enough. He was sick and tired of them racing up and down the road each day, on the way to school, on the way back to school, so he decided to pull them over and do a traffic stop. So he pulled over Bill Miller, and he said, he knew who he was. He knew all the boys and girls of the town. He said, "Bill Miller, if I ever see you speeding again in Scottsdale or in Tempe, I'm going to put you in jail. If you're ever I see this car in Tempe, you're going to jail." And he says, "Yes, sir. You won't see me again in this car, sir. Thank you." And off he goes. The next morning comes, and he says to his father, Charles, "Hey, Dad, can I borrow your car?" So he takes his father's car, and he feels like he's good to go. A couple hours later, Charles realizes that he's forgot to get something from the pharmacy. And there's no pharmacy in Scottsdale. Where's the closest pharmacy? Tempe. So he gets into his son's car, the Model T, and he drives off to Tempe, and the sheriff's deputy sees him and can't believe it the very next day. So he pulls him over, and then he sees that it's Charles Miller and not Bill Miller. Well, he gives Charles a piece of his mind about his son and what he's doing. This has got to stop. And Charles Miller said, "You know what? I think it's time for the boys and girls of Scottsdale to have their own high school, that they don't have to bother you anymore." And he comes back and he donates 10 acres of land off of Indian School Road that becomes Scottsdale High School. Now, I used to tell everyone that there were beavers in the area at the time, and they became the Scottsdale High School Beavers. That was their thing. But Joan Fadala recently did a presentation, our treasure of a historian, and she said that it actually wasn't beavers, they were muskrats. But the people of Scottsdale didn't want their town. Could you imagine it being like a James Cagney film festival? "You dirty rat." So they didn't want to do that. So they said, "No, they're not muskrats, they're beavers." And they became the Scottsdale High School Beavers. And the Scottsdale High School continued from 1923 until 1983, when it was closed down and is now office buildings, and it's a hotel. It's a whole bunch of different things on the north side of Indian School Road between like Buckboard and Drinkwater. I was able to locate on the library's website the first graduating class of Scottsdale High School. I was really pleased that they put that on there and made it available to people. So here it is. There's Bill Miller on the left, Hunter Chestnut's on the right, and Murle Miller's behind them. Imagine for a second, poor Murle Miller. Who are you going to go to the prom with? What if you got into a fight with the one guy you can go with? And literally, that's it. And what about Bill Miller? He can go with nobody. He's by himself, or he's third wheeling the whole night. But they do have this photo. It's an awesome picture to see Bill, Hunter, and Murle. Charles Miller had Winfield Scott's house removed, and he ordered from a Sears Craftsman home that was put at Scottsdale and Indian School Road on the northeast corner. And here's a picture of Charles Miller in front of his Sears Craftsman home. And it stayed there for a long time until about the 50s, when a steakhouse wanted that corner. So they very nicely had the home picked up and moved to about Miller and Thomas Road and plopped there. And it stayed there until about 2000. And in 2000, it was picked up again and moved to 6938 East First Street, where it is today, just a little bit to the west of Goldwater Boulevard off of First Street. And you can see that, and you can actually go in. And I understand the person who's running the boutique now that has this thing says that it's the oldest home in Scottsdale. And at first I said, wait a minute, what about the Titus House? And I believe the argument is that the Titus House wasn't in the original town of Scottsdale that this was. So that's the argument that this is the oldest home of Scottsdale. Charles Miller was honored with a statue. Does anybody know where it is? We're in front of the CVS at Miller Road, of course, named after him, and at Indian School Road. And then there's a plaque that you can read up there. It says, a civic leader of Scottsdale, So he, with two others, founded the Scottsdale Light and Power Company, which was bought by that brought electricity to Scottsdale in 1918. He served on the board of directors of the Salt River Water Usage Association. In 1922, he donated 10 acres of land for Scottsdale High School. Miller Road was named in his honor. A lot of people will drive by that and think it's either Winfield Scott or it's Herb Drinkwater. No beard, it's just Charles Miller. Another great story of Scottsdale that I call tough as nails in Scottsdale. That is George and Mary Cavalier were living in California in 1909 when his brother told him, his brother lived in Phoenix, and he said that they needed someone to keep this dredge that's going to redig the Arizona Canal. They needed someone who knew machines and machinery to keep it going. So he applied for the job, and he got it, and he moved through the area, and he went through the whole Arizona Canal, and he decided from all this that where he wanted to open up a blacksmith shop was Scottsdale. Here's a picture of him and his wife and their first child, Alice Cavalier. That's the dredge in the background, and they're going to Phoenix to buy some stuff on this particular day in a wagon. So he became a blacksmith around 1910 in Scottsdale. Here's a picture of his first blacksmith shop on 2nd Avenue. Now, he originally wanted to buy land at Main and Scottsdale Road, but the town elders came to him and said, no, you can't build a dirty, smelly blacksmith shop on Main Street. You got to go way out in the boonies. You got to go to 2nd Street. So he went and he bought that land, and that, to this day, is the Cavalier Blacksmith Shop. You can see this first picture shows the Cavalier Blacksmith Shop with a roof but no walls. Later, it would be walls but no roof, and he did work 365 days of the year in his blacksmith shop, a blast furnace without a roof. The story that George Cavalier Sr., George Cavalier, the current George Cavalier, who's the third of that name, the grandson of this George Cavalier, said that his father finally built a roof when he had set up one section to be a boxing ring and wrestling, and he would bring in boxers and wrestlers from Phoenix to box and wrestle, and he would charge a nickel. And one day there was only a handful of people around the ring watching it, but he heard a lot more people laughing and applauding, and he looked up and they were in trees watching, so they wouldn't have to pay him a nickel. So at first he thought about cutting down the trees, and then he thought, no, I'm going to put a roof on this thing so they can't do that anymore. So today you can still see the Cavalier Blacksmith Shop at Brown and 2nd Street. And here's some pictures. Jamie and I went down to the blacksmith shop, and we saw George Cavalier one day. This actually says November 1st, 2017. A couple of things I want to point out to you. Where you see the forge, that's where the original boxing ring was. And you see here there's a yellow sign. I'm going to show you in just a second what that sign was. You can see that if you're there, you can see the sign very clearly. Here it is. This is the first traffic sign of Scottsdale. It says, incorporated June 25th, 1951, population 2,032, Scottsdale town limits, the westmost western town, 25 miles per hour, and my favorite line in this whole sign, officer on duty, one. Because that's all they had in 1951, one officer on duty. And then it said, welcome. Here's another little tip for you. If you go on Saturday between December and March, George Cavalier and his wife, Elizabeth, are doing recreations of what it was like for their grandfather to do all these, to make all the stuff. And you can watch him make different things. And here's a little insider tip for you. If you ask his wife to get a tour of his museum, it's like the hidden gem of this whole thing. His grandfather and father and him are collectors. They collect the most interesting, unusual, strange items that you wouldn't believe. For example, there's a motorcycle from the 50s that, like, why is it there? When I was walking through that, I saw that they had a toilet from the Yuma prison. I was like, why do you have that? And they said, oh, my grandfather got it and just put it back here and just never took it out. And they had like the first switchboard for the telephone operators of Scottsdale is back there in his little museum. Absolutely fascinating to go through. and see that stuff. The TV show American Pickers would probably spend months back there and have just the time of their lives. So that's another little insider tip for you. This next section is on the Corral family, more than just great Mexican food. Tomas Corral bought 2 tracts of land in the Escatel. And there's an awesome book, and I'll tell you about it in a second, but it tells the whole story of how the family decided to come to Scottsdale. And it's just too long to go into. It's like a 300-page book, so I don't want to tell you the whole story, but it's absolutely fascinating if you get a chance to read it. Essentially, his wife decided, and his wife is this lady right here, that her children were not going to work in mines in Mexico. They were going to come and be farmers somewhere. So they came up to, recruited by E.O. Brown to work in the cotton gin. He worked really hard, and he ended up purchasing land that is still owned today by the family. It's called Los Olivos, and that stands for the olive trees, and it's right in front of olive trees that are on 2nd Street, just off of Drinkwater Boulevard. It's awesome Mexican food. I love to go there. I love to eat there. It's always a treat. And whenever my family has out-of-town guests, we always take them to Los Olivos. How many restaurants that you can go to, it's been around since the 40s. There's the story that the family tells is that the 2 brothers that opened, that were the sons of Tomas Corral, opened it after they had gone to Phoenix in their uniforms from serving in the army, and they were denied service. And they said, we're going to open our own restaurant where no one will be turned away. So they came and they opened their own restaurant, Los Olivos. Let me just show you this quickly. You see this on top, this interesting sort of Aztec-like art thing. That was designed by this man, Jesus Corral, one of the brothers of Tomas, one of the sons of Tomas Corral. And he wrote this book, Carro Amigo. And this is the book that I was telling you about, this incredible story. And if I told you, you'd say I made it up. There's kidnapping, and there's broken hearts, and lost love, and unrequited love, and it goes on and on and on. And a very clever woman who's a great businesswoman, and it goes on. It's just a phenomenal story. This next section I call Here Come the Songs. Johnny Rose opened a pool hall about 1914, and he had a bad reputation from wherever he had come from. They said that he ran a brothel. And so people in Scottsdale weren't too crazy about him, and he ended up getting married, so he tried to make the place a little bit nicer and didn't quite do it. Finally, the townspeople had enough, and there were rumors that there was opium smells coming from this place, and there was rumors that there were ladies of the evening. So they essentially ran him out of town. And he sold it, he put up his place for sale. And fortunately for us, the Song family bought it. J. Chu Song was living in Chandler at the time, and he purchased that and opened it up as a grocery store. And today, it's still there, called Mexican Imports. And you can see right underneath that sign says Mexican Imports, still has the name J. Chu, even though J. Chu is long past. And Jason Song came to the very first presentation that I did, and he told this story in the middle of the presentation, and I asked him afterwards, can I share this afterwards? He said, absolutely. He said, in the 1990s, a business was located right across the street from Mexican Imports, and they filed a formal complaint with the city of Scottsdale that Scottsdale has very strict ordinances. You can't put out anything for sale in front of the business on the city street, except for Mexican Imports. They can't. So this guy files a complaint. It's not fair. And the planning department sends some zoning people over, and they happen to bring along Jason Song. And Jason Song tells this guy, well, yeah, I can tell you exactly why this business can do it. This business has been in business in Scottsdale since the 20s, before there was a Scottsdale. There were no ordinances, there were no anything at the time this store. And I can tell you that because it was my grandfather that opened this business. And the guy looks at him and says, you mean this business has been grandfathered in? I said, Jason, I love that story. I'm going to tell that if you let me. And he said, you can, Bruce. Home on the range. We're getting into the Browns. Okay, so there's E.O. Brown, started the general store. His son, Brownie, was 6'4", weighed about 250 pounds, almost always carried a gun with him. Charlie Bryle, who owned the Pink Pony Hotel, said he never had to hire a bouncer because Brownie liked to eat dinner there most nights. And if someone got restless or a problem, Brownie said, "That's enough." That was enough. He was so big, so intimidating, he was the bouncer of the Pink Pony without having to do anything. He was a great cattleman and was able to do all sorts of things. He formed a partnership with a good friend of his from the time they were children, and they controlled the 30, 40,000 acres of North Scottsdale that we now know as the preserve, or most of it that we know as the preserve. It came from Brownie. He hired a young guy, 18 years old at the time, named Garbacho Harvey Noriega, and he was a cowboy from Mexico, and he became the lead wrangler, and then finally he became the foreman of DC Ranch. And here you see him actually branding. Here's a picture of him branding cattle, and the guy holding on with his foot to hold the calf down, that's one of the Thomases, of Sarah Caldwell Thomas, who was the first postmistress of. This is one of her kids, because they're all connected to the Browns and the Thomases. Harvey was considered the cowboy of Scottsdale for his day. He lived till he was 104 years old, which is in 1998, and his home, I'll tell you about his home in just a second. Before I tell you about his home, the local artist Jean Pennington, who also happened to be Brownie's daughter, was commissioned to make the city of Scottsdale seal. And she said, "We're going with the most western town. What's the most western thing she could think of?" And that was Harvey. So the next time you take a look at the seal and you see that there's a cowboy on a bucking bronco, that's Harvey Noriega on that bucking bronco. So here's Harvey's home on 2nd Street in Brown. It's now the Noriega Livery Stable. And right now you can go over there, and it is the Parada del Sol Museum. And you see it, I believe, on the weekends. We're going now into the 50s, so let's give you a little background. The first mayor of Scottsdale was Malcolm White. He was born in Glendale. He moved to Scottsdale at the age of 5. He graduated from Scottsdale High School after being elected school student body president. He first worked for the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office as a deputy and then State Highway Patrol into the 40s. When World War II broke out, he became an instructor at the Thunderbird Airfield, which today we would call Scottsdale Airport. And then he was an entrepreneur in the town of Scottsdale. He started a cafe called Whitey's Cafe. He purchased it. It was Hamer's Cafe, then the All Right Cafe. Then he made it Whitey's Cafe on Brown. It burned to the ground. He bought some other land. He moved it to Scottsdale and Main Street on the southeast corner, where until recently was the Italian Grotto. That was Whitey's Cafe, or Whitey's Restaurant. Then it was purchased by Ping Bell, and then Claudia, can't think of her last name, became the Pink Pony. Then that moved. Now it's been the Italian Grotto since the 70s and recently closed. He also opened up the very first movie theater in 1948. He called it the T-Bar T. It had a smoking lounge and a special room for children who were crying. If you got fussy, they had a special soundproof room so that it didn't bother the people in the theater. And this picture on the left is the first day that it opened. They gave everyone a free movie to come and see this nice new theater. Until that time, if you wanted to go to the movies in Scottsdale, you had to go to Phoenix. In 1951, there was a big brouhaha because they found out that Phoenix wanted to annex all the land to take over Scottsdale. And they went to the people and they said, "Do you want that?" And most people said, "No, we really don't." Well, if you don't want it, sign this petition. Most of the town signed the petition. They took the petition to the county, and based on that, the county allowed Scottsdale to be incorporated as a town in 1951. And the county appointed the mayor and the council. Well, they appointed the council, and the council elected the mayor. So the first mayor was Malcolm White. Some of the other people here are interesting because this guy on the left, Bill Miller, he shows up again on the town council. The same boy with the little blue sailor suit, the same one that raced the car that we got to high school from, here he's on the first town council. This is Mort Kimsey, the son of the Kimsey that was the first, one of the three guys that started the first electric company. This is E.G. Scott, the other blacksmith in town, and this is the clerk, Jack Sweeney. So this is kind of a famous picture taken from the newspaper. Malcolm White loved this T-Bar T, the Western theme, and he convinced the Chamber of Commerce to adopt that as their slogan before there was a town of Scottsdale. So once the town of Scottsdale was incorporated, the westmost western town was a perfect fit. They made Main Street all have all the different western motif, and they put up signs right here that would say, Scottsdale a mile away, Scottsdale 3 miles, just follow these cowboys and you'll get to the westmost western town. This is another sign I found in the library's thing that says, welcome to Scottsdale, the westmost western city limits. That didn't last very long. I think this is probably just a sample sign. But the funny thing was that Scottsdale early on adopted one of the most strict sign codes. So guess what was one of the first things that had to go? That was a violation of the sign code and the sign ordinance, so that had to all come down. There is one of them left, and that's at Main Street and Scottsdale Road, the cowboy. You can still see. This is an old one that people would put down. It was like a chalkboard, and they would say, like, there's a New Year's Eve party. Come to the Paradise Valley Racket Club. Here's the phone number. Now we're moving into the 60s. The new city of Scottsdale in 1961, everyone put out their trash in the alleys, and then guys had to go down and pick up the trash and dump it. And no one lasted more than 1 year doing this, because as soon as the summer hit and it hit 110, they all quit. No one would do it. So they're trying to hire some new people, they quit. They wouldn't do it. People got injured. Here you see them trying to do it. They tried their best. It just did not work. So the city manager, Bill Donaldson, had a committee of people. It was like an innovation committee, and they would have people bring their problems and then try and come up with solutions. And so one of the guys brought this problem about, we can't keep people as garbage the collectors, they just don't want to stay around. So they challenged the city to come up with a solution. And the solution, they brought in this guy named Chuck Kalinowski. He was a firefighter and he was also an engineer. And he could build things and design things, and he just did incredible stuff with this whole committee of people. And they ended up designing an arm that would pick up this trash can and dump it into the back of a can. No one anywhere in the world had this. They had tried it in places, but it didn't work. And the big flaw that everyone else had was they let you the residents could put out whatever size container they wanted, and this thing would try and adjust to pick it up and not crush it. Scottsdale came up with the idea of everyone had to have the same can, the same size, so the machine could pick it up. And that was the innovation that changed garbage collection, not just in Scottsdale, but in the world. So this guy, Chuck, one day the arm wasn't working, he was trying to lift it up, and someone said, well, you got to do better, Chuck. And they said, what do you guys want from me? This thing, it's a monster. It's Godzilla. So the name stuck. Everyone loved it, and that became Godzilla. And that's two pictures of Godzilla, the first garbage truck in the world, was right here in Scottsdale. Mark Stragier is one of the key people that was in charge of public works at this time, and he stayed here for the development of the program. After 11 years, he went on to some other companies, and he, again, perpetuated this thing until they came up with the side loader, and he truly is known today, well, he died a few years ago, but he's known as the father of mechanized refuse collection. His wife, Meg, actually met with me so that we could get a lot of these photos and things. It was really cool. We're in our home stretch. We've got two more people to go. These are two incredible people, and one of them, hopefully some of you know, because he's still alive. And that's Bill Walton. Scottsdale had a problem with what was known as the slough. There was just this big area that nothing could grow, nothing could really be done with because it would flood all the time. And they would try and grow stuff, and it just wouldn't work there. They would try to use the land, build a building, and it would wash away. It just didn't work out. And this guy, Bill Walton, was a landscape architect, and he had to walk from his home across a bridge, and he saw the slough every day to get to his work as a landscape architect. And he looked down and he noticed that when it was flooding, the sand would be kept away, but if there was grass, it would stick hold and wouldn't wash away. And during this whole time, the city was saying, what do we do with this? They contacted the Army Corps of Engineers. The Army Corps of Engineers proposed to build a cement ravine, just like they had done for Los Angeles. And imagine what Scottsdale would be like today if we had a cement ravine running down the middle of the city. Well, Bill Walton said, what if we do something different? What if we do a green belt? And the Army Corps of Engineers said, what's a green belt? And he said, I don't know, I just thought of it. Now, to give the Army Corps of Engineers their due, this was totally outside the box thinking. No one had ever known about this. That this was something that they just came up with. That he just thought this idea, what if we turn it into a green area? We'll do parks and golf courses and whatever else can be on this thing. But if it floods, it would just wash out. The Army Corps of Engineers wanted a little bit of proof, so they did a little portion of El Dorado Park like this that was on the green belt. And a flood came through, and it was very minor damage. Now, normally it would be terrible damage, and it was enough for the Army Corps of Engineers to say, okay, that makes a lot of sense. It obviously worked. Let's look at designing a green belt. And they began building, but this took a long process. So a lot of people thought this was a boondoggle. A lot of people thought that this was just millions of dollars of wasted money. Until the 1970s, 1970 and 1972, there were two great floods that literally split the city into two. And when those floods happened, people said, okay, maybe we do need to do something about it. Maybe this really is a problem. And how are we going to do this? We're going to have to tax ourselves to build this green belt. And then finally bonds were passed because of that. The Army Corps of Engineers started to build it, and it started in 73. It took a long time until 1984 when they finally opened up the green belt. So Bill Walton, from that original idea, was made the chair of the committee that studied the slough and what they were going to do with it. He became the city planning director. He was elected to city council, and he's one of the people who's known as the father of the Indian Bend Wash. And now we're at one of my favorite people of all, Mr. Scottsdale, Herb Drinkwater. Herb was born in Batavia, New York in 1936, and at the age of about 7, his family was told that because of his medical condition, he needed to go to a very warm place. He could go to California, but it might be better if he tried Arizona. So his father was a math teacher. He wrote to 3 school districts, and all 3 offered him a job based on the letter. He picked North High, and they moved first to Phoenix, and he was invited over for dinner at the principal's house, and the principal lived where the Valley Ho is today. And Herb came over with his parents, and the principal had children, and he went out playing. So this kid went from just like a year ago being told he's probably going to die to now he's playing, running out with kids, having a great old time. When his parents finally found him, he was in some sort of water retention area swimming. And they couldn't believe that this kid who they were told was going to die was now swimming. So they decided, obviously, this was good for his health. And they ended up buying some land and moving to Scottsdale. Herb became part of the STEP committee. That was the Scottsdale Town Enrichment Programs. About 300 citizens. This was early strategic development or strategic planning before anyone knew the term strategic planning. What we're sitting in today is a result of the Scottsdale Town Enrichment Program. This Kiva, the Civic Center Library, the mall, this was all ideas from 50 years ago from the STEP program. He ended up getting elected to the city council in 1970 to 1978. His main platform was no tall buildings. And if you could convince him somehow that a building could be tall. You then had to convince his wife, and that was harder. But he was then elected mayor in 1980, and then he was elected again, and again, till 1996 when he had to step down because he was diagnosed with cancer. Some of the things that he's known for. The Indian Ben Wash was started when he was a councilman, and it was finished when he was the mayor. The Little Red Schoolhouse was turned into the museum when he was mayor. There he is cutting the ribbon, and Bill Walton is the one to his left. He had a 96% approval rating while he was mayor. Can you imagine any elected official today having a 96% approval rating? It's unheard of. The Mayo Clinic of Scottsdale was convinced to come to Scottsdale because of Herb Drinkwater. He flew to Rochester to talk to their CEO. The Tournament Players Club of Scottsdale happened when he was mayor. The All Arabian Horse Show, the McDowell Sonoran Preserve, our jewel of a preserve, not a park, but a preserve in the northern part of Scottsdale. That was all the original E.O. Brown land, has been now made into a preserve that they say close to 1 million, I think it's 800,000 people a year go and hiking in the preserve. Scottsdale Stadium was renovated. It was originally built in the 50s. It was renovated in the 90s while he was mayor. Herb Drinkwater was everywhere. I can tell you personally, I took my nephew when my nephew was about 4 years old, and I was maybe 21. My brother and sister-in-law are a little bit older than me, and they went away on some vacation, and I was looking after my nephew and niece, and I took my nephew to a birthday party at McCormick Ranch. So this would have been the mid-'80s. And I was sitting with the dads, and we're just sitting and talking, and a guy walks up in a cowboy hat and says, "How's the party? How's the birthday going?" And one of the dads goes, "It's going great. Who are you?" And he said, "I'm Herb Drinkwater. I'm the mayor of Scottsdale." And I think my jaw dropped, and I said, "You're the mayor, and you come to a birthday party?" And he looked at me with a smile and said, "I care about everyone in Scottsdale." That was just Herb Drinkwater. He could have easily said, "Look, you little blah, blah," and he could have put me in my place. He didn't. He was just a classy guy. I've talked to police officers who were working at the time he was mayor. It would be like 110 degrees out. They're directing traffic like this, like barely conscious. And Herb would pull up in his car and say, "Hey, you take a break, you go sit in my air-conditioned car, I'll direct traffic." And the officer said, "Mayor, I can't do that, I can't leave my post." And he'd say, "Who's the mayor? Get in my car." So, "Yes, sir." And they get in the car and the air conditioning, and there'd be Herb directing traffic. Just an incredible person. And everyone who works with him has stories like this. People to this day will come up to me and say, when they know I'm a city employee, they say, "Did you know Herb Drinkwater?" And I said, "Well, I got to meet him once." But he literally was everywhere all the time. Just incredible stories about him. As I mentioned, he died of cancer in the 90s. They put up a statue. It's actually just out in front of the building we're in right now. You can see a picture of Herb Drinkwater and his dog. Drinkwater Boulevard, this building is called 3939 North Drinkwater Boulevard. We're on named after him. This is a picture from his grave marker that mentions that he was the mayor of Scottsdale, the city council, and it says he loved his city and he believed in its citizens. Now, I was doing some research on the library's website, and I found a video interview of Herb Drinkwater, and it had this quote, and it was one of the things like, "Oh my gosh, this is the greatest quote of Herb Drinkwater," and he just said it, like it was just like a throwaway comment to him. It was just what he said. But when I've done this presentation, people will frequently try and take pictures of this, so that's why the quote is actually on the handout that I gave you, because so many people wanted this quote. It says, "I've always believed the government is here for the people, for the citizens. There's no other reason for government other than for the people. We can't always please every single person who lives here, but we need to give them attention." That was Herb Drinkwater in a simple statement. Just incredible that he did that. That's the end of From Scott to Drinkwater for now. I do want to tell you guys that next month I'm doing the story called Scottsdale Stories with a Twist. 3 stories that all have some relevance to today that none of us remember or don't know why that street is called this or whatever it is. And you see the picture back from E.O. Brown's store that you see why this thing has a connection to Scottsdale today and to a resort. It's actually quite interesting. Here's some of the people who helped me with all the research that I did for this thing and helped with doing some of the research. Here's some of the sources, and some of those sources are in your handouts. Some of the books that I've used. Thank you very much.